Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Caitlin and I upload a whole bunch of different types of videos on this channel, mainly surrounding true crime and psychological cases and all things education. So I'm back after a little break again. I'm really excited to be doing these videos again because I found so many new cases that are just baffling and a lot that I have never heard of before. So if you guys do have some requests for specific cases you'd like me to research, then definitely leave them in the comments below because I'm always looking for new things to research. So I'm just going to chuck in my usual disclaimer here, as I usually do at the start of my videos, just letting you guys know that I'm not claiming to be an expert in this case or any of the other cases I cover over on my channel. I'm simply relaying the information that I'm able to find myself through my own research on the internet, and because obviously only certain sources are accessible to me, it means I may get things wrong, mispronounce things or leave things out, and I apologise if I do any of those things. I'm not trying to cause anyone any harm or an injustice. I'm just simply working with the information that I have available to me. And for today's case, we're going to be discussing the unresolved disappearance of Amanda Gallion, and there's a couple of different theories which I'll obviously go into at the end. It's just very fascinating, so I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts once you've finished the case and we heard some of the theories, see what you guys think, because I know I've definitely read a lot of different opinions online and it'd be fascinating to hear some of your guys's. So with all that being said, we shall just go ahead and get started with the case. Amanda Dawn Gallion was born on September the 13th in the year of 1983, and at the time of her disappearance she was 14 years old, living in a place called Gillette in Wyoming. Amanda was naturally blonde-haired and blue-eyed, although in her early teen years she actually began dyeing her hair darker, almost verging on black, so at the time of her disappearance her natural dark blonde hair was a dyed black colour. She spent much of her free time expressing her love of music, specifically that of the country and western genre of music, and she was also particularly talented at playing the violin. The day was the 13th of October 1997, and Amanda, who was then 14 years old, headed out from her home in the early morning as usual to head to school. She travelled to school most mornings by herself on her bike, and to all those who knew her it just seemed like another typical weekday morning. However, when the time came that the school day ended and Amanda had not yet returned home from school, concern began to set in. Amanda's parents had waited at home expecting their daughter, considering the possibility that there was some sort of typical Monday reason as to why she was delayed, but when 6 PM that evening rolled around and there was still no sign of her, they were just overcome with panic. They immediately reported her as a missing child, as this really was not typical behaviour of Amanda, and they headed out themselves as well as with some local law enforcement officers in search of the young girl around the local area. Initially, the most logical place to begin the search for Amanda had been the daily route to and from school, where she would typically ride her bike every single day, as well as attempting to chase up the school as to determine whether or not she had actually turned up for school that morning. And as it would turn out, she'd never made it to any of her classes that day. The search very quickly turned up something particularly worrying. Amanda's bicycle had been abandoned on the side of a road. It had been found in an area not far from the I-90 road, which had opened up the concern that maybe she wasn't in the local area anymore, and that possibly, rather than being nearby as they'd initially imagined, she may have been further away than they realised. And once their search of the initial area had not turned up any other sign of Amanda, law enforcement began to consider those potentially having some involvement or at least some knowledge of what happened to her. Their initial focus had been on Amanda's boyfriend at the time. His name was Patrick Gehring, who had been actually 20 years old at the time when she was just 14 years old. The age difference in their relationship had raised a few concerns due to the nature of a number of similar cases that I'm sure you guys are familiar with, of children disappearing at the hands of adults who have groomed them over time, and so this just seemed like an important avenue to consider. They couldn't ignore the possibility of this being a scenario. And Patrick had stated that he had last seen Amanda at 7:15 AM that morning while she was riding her bike to school. Despite his claims that he hadn't seen her past that point early in the morning, it was widely believed that he had had more involvement in her disappearance than he was letting on. More specifically, people believed at the time that Amanda had chosen to run away from home and Patrick was aiding her in keeping her hidden. And Patrick had been openly accused of this numerous times, however he continually denied having any involvement in her disappearance. The search for answers and Amanda continued, but then something entirely unexpected happened just a few days later later, on October the 19th, 1997, when Patrick Gehring became a missing person. His vehicle was discovered abandoned on the side of a road facing the wrong direction, and there was absolutely no sign of him past this point. After the discovery of Patrick's abandoned vehicle, it was widely assumed that the likeliest possibility or scenario had been that the pair decided they would run off together and start a new life, although it is worth noting that since that point, since both of them were declared as missing people, there has been absolutely no activity on either of their social security numbers since that point, which means neither of them would have been able to get a job or a credit card, a car, anything like that. Otherwise the activity would have notified the authorities. So that is just an interesting point to note, because realistically, if the pair had chosen to run off together, how would they be able to support themselves whilst not having any access to their social security numbers? There was little to no change in the investigation into both of their disappearances for the following few years, as authorities virtually had no information to go on. But then in the year of 2000, it was announced that the authorities had actually reopened the case in their hunt for Amanda Gallion, and they were looking into a man named Nathaniel Bar Jonah as a potential suspect. Bar Jonah was a convicted child predator, and he had been found on the radar of authorities when he became the prime suspect in the 1996 disappearance of a young 10-year-old boy named Zachary Ramsey. Zachary Ramsey's case had taken place a year prior to Amanda's disappearance and in Great Falls, Montana. Over years and spanning over a number of different crimes, there had been numerous allegations of Bar Jonah having participated in acts of cannibalism on top of his already known crimes. And these claims date all the way back to his early childhood, when he would allegedly ingest his own scabs, as well as confessing to unusual fantasies revolving around cannibalism and other concerning behaviours from a young age. And aside from this, his crimes mainly involved the sexual assault of minors. More specifically, a lot of his victims were prepubescent boys, although I have seen a number of sources state that as much as these victims did seem to be his focus, he did also have sexual assault allegations, with the victims being young girls as well. There had been some initial doubt in his involvement in Amanda's case, as she did not, like I said, match his typical victim profile, victim type. But when these doubts were openly shared, it was argued, like I said, that he didn't just specifically target young boys, he did also target young girls as victims as well. But a lot of people that knew Amanda actually came forward and said that it is possible for a stranger to have come across Amanda on her bike and having mistaken her for a young boy, as she was rather small and she may have had her hair up, she got dark hair, so it is entirely possible that she could have been mistaken for a young boy if that was the case. And investigators were actually able to determine that on October the 12th, so the day prior to Amanda's disappearance, Bar Jonah had actually checked into a motel in Gillette at 8 PM, and they couldn't provide any sort of explanation as to why he made this sudden journey from Montana to Gillette, which would have taken him just under 7 hours to travel there by car. And then the next sighting of Bar Jonah that they could get was the following day visiting an antiques shop in a place called Billings in Montana at 2 PM the following day, which was then followed by him returning to Great Falls that evening. Due to his potential involvement in multiple open cases, law enforcement were able to gain permission to search inside Bar Jonah's home, where they actually discovered crushed bone fragments. I believe it was about 21 crushed bone fragments in total, buried inside his garage. These bone fragments were then sent off for DNA testing, and they received a negative match with both Zachary Ramsey and Amanda Gallion. And ultimately, the investigation into Zachary Ramsey's case couldn't link Bar Jonah directly to that case, which means he didn't receive any conviction for Zachary Ramsey's case, but he was ultimately sentenced to 130 years in prison for numerous other crimes he committed against children. He did partially serve his sentence, but then in 2008 he passed away without any confirmation as to whether he did have some involvement in Amanda's disappearance. And then little else occurred in the investigation until some years later in 2007. In Elk Point, South Dakota, a man serving time in prison had claimed that his cellmate had confessed to the sexual assault and murder of Amanda Gallion. The man's name was Aloysius Black Crow, and he had told authorities that he'd witnessed his cellmate, whose name was James Strahl, confessing to being involved in Amanda's case. And if you have watched any of my previous videos, the name Aloysius Black Crow would sound familiar to you, and this is because his name also popped up in a similar occurrence in another case, in the disappearance of Cheryl Miller and Pamela Jackson in 1971. So in that prior case, the two young women had not turned up at a party that they were expected at, that, and so the pair of them plus their car had gone missing. In 2007, Aloysius Black Crow had told authorities that he'd been secretly taping another inmate, so his name was David Lycan, and this secret tape of this inmate had caught him allegedly confessing to the sexual assault and murder of these two young girls. And when the remains of these two women were later found and it was ultimately determined that their death had been an accident, it was discovered that Aloysius's claims were fake, and he'd actually convinced another inmate to fake being David Lycan on the videotapes. Ultimately, the charges against Lycan were dropped, and Aloysius was later convicted on a perjury charge. In the same year that he had attempted to implicate Lycan in the disappearance of Cheryl Miller and Pamela Jackson, he'd also testified as a witness in the trial against his cellmate James Strahl on the initial charge that had gotten him into prison in the first place. And throughout this trial, Strahl had denied having any involvement in Amanda's case, and since there had been no evidence suggesting otherwise, nothing came about. This link wasn't really confirmed. But then following this point, the incident involving David Lycan and the Cheryl Miller and Pamela Jackson case had occurred, and it had immediately brought up all of this speculation, and it just put into question the legitimacy of Aloysius Black Crow's claims as having knowledge of this inmate being involved in Amanda Gallion's case. James Strahl ended up receiving a 35-year prison sentence for his involvement in another case and continually denied having any involvement in the Amanda Gallion disappearance. And James Strahl then died in 2014 with no evidence suggesting he was lying. So we're going to move on to theories now, because the potential suspects, they're all kind of theoretical, potential links. There's no evidence suggesting anything is solidified at the minute, so I just wanted to go through some of the theories that I've seen sort of floating around on the internet, just so you guys can see some of the potential scenarios that people have suggested, see what you guys think could have happened, and let me know your thoughts down below. This case is just another one where there just seems to be no specific direction that seems to be the likeliest, as you'll find some people genuinely believe one scenario had happened while others would argue something completely different. The first theory would be that Amanda had disappeared as a result of foul play that she had met while on her way to school that morning. And this theory is often linked with the potential suspect Bar Jonah, who I had previously mentioned, as he was believed to have been in the area at the time that she would have disappeared. However, there are a number of people that do dispute the likelihood of her fitting his victim profile. And due to both potential suspects, so Bar Jonah and James Strahl, having died while in prison, it currently can't be confirmed as to whether either of them had any involvement whatsoever. One of the most obvious theories would be that Amanda and her boyfriend Patrick had decided to run away together and to cut off all contact with their families. She is still actually classed as an endangered runaway, as authorities have no physical evidence of foul play, although many argue otherwise, and a lot of investigators do argue that they think there was something else at play here. Another possibility follows the previous scenario that the pair had decided to run away, but after doing so something had happened to them both. And this mainly, I think, seemed like a plausible scenario because, like I said previously, there was no sign of any activity on either of their social security numbers past them being declared as missing people. And a lot of people have also suggested that it is possible that maybe Patrick had gotten himself into trouble and Amanda had gotten involved and suffered as a result. It has been argued that this scenario could explain why Patrick went missing mysteriously just a few days after Amanda did. Some have suggested that it was entirely possible that the explanation for Patrick's disappearance had been that he genuinely had no involvement in Amanda's disappearance, but he knew he was about to become a prime suspect and decided to head out and start a new life somewhere before getting himself in any trouble. But on the flip side of that, he may have had some direct hand in Amanda's disappearance, and this is why he would have chosen to disappear. I've seen numerous suggestions floating around that Amanda's family may have had some involvement in Patrick's disappearance specifically, as some people have suggested that they believe it could be that her family believed, they were adamant that he was to blame for her disappearance and potential death, and they decided to take justice into their own hands. But I'm particularly doubtful of this theory. I just think this is a bit of a stretch, and there is absolutely no evidence to suggest this would be the case. Aside from these specific theories, there are also many variations of them, such as Amanda's disappearance having been committed by someone who Patrick knew, and he only met his fate once he went to that person and confronted them as to why they did something to Amanda, and just others along the same lines. There's sort of very similar variations along different scenarios. For me, at this current point in time, it seems as though there is the most evidence suggesting Amanda's case had some relation to Bar Jonah, but that's not to say there isn't any holes in that theory. Aside from this, it does seem to be a pretty popular theory that they decided to run away together and something had happened to them past this point. So let me know what your guys' thoughts are, because like I said, there's just so many scenarios that could have happened, because not only did Amanda disappear but also her boyfriend. It's just, I'd love to know what you guys think, what scenario sort of sticks out and screams to you as being likely. So that's where I'm going to end today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know if you have any case suggestions down below, and I'll see you guys very soon for another video. Thanks for watching. Bye.